So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be love. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be love by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be love by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be love and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be love and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be love and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second part of our housing crisis conversation. And I would like to share with you that this evening we're going to continue the conversation. The King Center has collaborated with Inclusive to have some courageous conversations about the housing crisis. And so we'd like to introduce you to a short video in a moment, but please register for the Inclusive Courageous Conversation using the QR code on the screen. It is not too late, and it'll follow this presentation. Again, it comes right after this presentation at 7:15 p.m. So you can register utilizing that QR code. And so I'd like to show you a short video to tell you a little bit about our courageous conversations and our collaboration with Inclusive.
Affordable housing affects us all. It shapes our neighborhoods, impacts our families, and determines our future. In fact, your zip code has a greater impact on your health than your genetic code. So what can you do? By engaging in meaningful conversations, we can drive greater awareness, challenge existing norms, and pave the way for transformative change. We invite you to join the Be Love in the Housing Crisis conversation in partnership with the King Center and Inclusive. This online conversation will use the Inclusive Conversation model designed to create a safe space for open dialogue and engage with individuals from various backgrounds. You'll have the opportunity to share your own experiences and perspectives on affordable housing, deepen your understanding of the issue, and explore ways you can take action. Mark your calendar and register to attend this conversation on July 25th at 7:15 p.m. Eastern. Affordable housing is not just a matter of shelter. It is a fundamental human right that shapes the fabric of society. Together, we can contribute to a world where safe, sustainable, and affordable housing is within reach for all. Join us.
Good evening again. I'm Tyranny Thurmond, your moderator for this evening's conversation, part 2 of the housing crisis. If you weren't able to join us for our first portion, you can access the video on the King Center's YouTube page and the Facebook page. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we were able to accomplish in our last conversation. We talked a lot about how we got here and what some of the challenges families and individuals are facing due to the current housing crisis. In part 2 of this conversation, we'll be discussing envisioning sustainable solutions that prioritize accessibility, affordability, and inclusivity, exploring the role of government, private sectors, and of course, community-based initiatives in orchestrating comprehensive policy frameworks to address the diverse needs and the aspirations of our community members. Drawing inspiration from historical precedents and acknowledging the legacy of the visionary leaders such as Dr. King, who relentlessly advocated for fair housing practices, we seek to reimagine a future where housing is viewed as not just a commodity, but as a fundamental human right. In this pursuit, we aim to foster an inclusive exchange of ideas and perspectives, driving us to create more pragmatic solutions and strategies that will ultimately lead us out of the shadows of the housing crisis and into brighter, more equitable housing for all of us. I'd like to introduce you to tonight's conversationalists who have a wealth of knowledge. Again, if you joined us for the first conversation, you may remember Stephen Menadian, who's currently serving as the Assistant Director and the Director of Research at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. He also advises policymakers and organizers and organizations on diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. We're welcoming to the conversation this evening Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, a spiritual writer, preacher, and community cultivator who currently serves as the Assistant Director for Partnerships and Fellowship at Yale University Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. He's also a leader of the Red Letter Christian Movement and the Poor People's Campaign, and the author of the book, Reconstructing the Gospel and the Wisdom of Stability. Thank you so much, Stephen and Jonathan, for joining us for this critical conversation. So many of us are looking forward to more sustainable solutions. Stephen, hi there. Good to see you again.
Great to be back with you, Tyranny.
Good, and welcome, Jonathan. It's great to meet you.
Oh, wonderful to be with y'all. Thanks for inviting me into the conversation.
Absolutely. So, Stephen, you were here for part one, and we discussed how we got here. I want to get your thoughts first on, what are some successful examples of innovative solutions that other cities are implementing, or even countries, that we can learn from in addressing affordable housing?
Well, first, I think we should peel back the layers of the problem first. So we talked in our last conversation how there is really more than one crisis. We have a homelessness crisis. We have an affordable housing crisis. We have a housing affordability crisis, which is not the same thing. We have a crisis of a fair housing crisis, which isn't just about can people get into homes, but are they getting into homes that are inclusive, in communities that are inclusive, or segregated? And also we have a commuting crisis. We have crises where people are forced to live in neighborhoods that are far from their families, their churches and synagogues and temples, and far from jobs. So it's not just about getting people into a home. We want to get people into a home that's community rooted, community based, and has the array of amenities and supports that people need. It's not just, so there are empty, vacant homes out there, but we need to get people into a home that fits their needs and serves their, and connects them into community. So let's just deal with one of those problems first, which is the homelessness problem. Cities, particularly on the coast, are struggling with surging numbers of unsheltered people. One of the cities, surprisingly, that has done a remarkable job is Houston. So Houston has put together a phenomenal program. And part of the way in which they've reduced homelessness by over 60% over the last 10 years is that they have partnered every level of government and the public and private sector together to make sure they align all of the programs and services that can actually get people into stable housing. So one of the things they do is they guarantee every single person, to the best of their ability, to get into temporary housing, to get people accommodated to temporary housing and shelter in the private market. And once they're in there, you're in there for at least 9 to 12 months. You get used to living in that as opposed to actually being on the street, and you get wraparound services, which is different from the New York model. The New York model is a shelter system where they guarantee everyone at least a shelter bed, but not necessarily stable housing, right? There's a huge difference of being in a shelter and being in your own apartment at night. So I think the Houston model has proven to be very successful so far, at least at reducing homelessness. But there are a lot of things that can't be replicated out of that. Houston, at least historically, has less expensive housing than New York or San Francisco. So that's one challenge. As the cost of housing surge, it becomes harder and harder to get people into shelters. But I think part of it has to be a housing first strategy. And too often we do not do that.
Thank you for utilizing Houston as the example, Stephen. I wasn't familiar with their program. It seems like we have a guest from Dallas too, so we have someone that's in the house from the state of Texas. But again, thank you for using that as an example. How about you, Jonathan? Are you familiar with any countries or cities that are doing really well with utilizing a housing framework that we can maybe take some ideas from?
Well, let me say first, just briefly, sort of where I come into this conversation in terms of where I'm situated. I have been part of a hospitality house, so folks who've been housed and folks who've been homeless living together in a community in Durham, North Carolina for the last 20 years. And that house exists within the context of a community. It's a community called Walltown. It has a long and rich history, but it's a community that's been, it was dramatically impacted in the 20th century by redlining, and then in the 21st century has seen a lot of gentrification. And so at the community level, what we've watched happen is how this, what Stephen was describing as, an affordability crisis, actually breaking up a community of people who were able to live together, whether they were renting or owned, with people who they had known for generations, really, in walking distance from their church and from a rec center where they got together with people who they knew. And so all that makes community possible is often disrupted by the affordability crisis that says you can't afford to live here anymore, so you're going to have to travel, to where housing is more affordable. Just one way to make that really clear is the house that I live in is across the street from a rental that 20 years ago rented for $295 a month. There were three guys who'd grown up in the neighborhood. They rented the place together. None of them had, a full-time permanent job, but they did odd jobs and made ends meet, and they shared that house together. The same house, which might have had a new kitchen or something put in, but it's the same house, same two-bedroom house. It rents for $1,800 a month today. So what we've seen is a dramatic increase in the cost of housing that has not, by any means been equaled by an increase in wages or other things that would make life affordable for individuals and families. So when I come to thinking about the problem, the question of housing, I think about it in the sort of context of this broader affordability crisis that we're dealing with. And as a part of today's Poor People's Campaign, I am completely on board with the agenda that says, we have to invest in affordable housing, but that has to be part of a movement that says we need living wages, we need access to health care, and those things need to go together. And so I very much think about it in terms of, yes, there are countries, that have that, and so we know it's possible. We also have lots of policies that have been tried at the city and state level that we know can work. So many of the arguments against these things, we know that there's not a whole lot to them. So the question is, what is it that's keeping us in this situation, right? So that's kind of where I focus a lot of my attention. What is it that's keeping us from having the things that people know that we need? And I think the short answer to that is that we're in a sort of, we're caught in this country in a kind of a politics that keeps us from having the things that we could afford and that we know how to make happen if we had the collective will to do them. And one of the ways that gets maintained in our politics is through the old myth of race that just gets repeated over and over again. So I'll be brief here, but one of the ways I say this is that, part of my own journey as someone who was raised white in the South and raised in this context is that I had to come to the realization that affordable housing was something that the federal government had made possible for families like mine. And I came to that realization as an adult when I looked back at my life and realized that both of my great grandmothers, who I had been very close to as a child, lived in public housing that was made available because of federal investments. That, as a matter of fact, my people, the people of my community, had been taught to reject by politicians who said that the federal government was bad and that it was betraying our traditional family values. So there's a whole narrative here that I think has persuaded a lot of our communities to be pitted against one another, when in fact we need a collective coming together in order to make the investments that are needed to have things we need, like affordable housing. So that's sort of how I come to this question and think about it.
Yeah, you were onto something so good there, Jonathan. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the social implications of race and how that impacts people. And so I'm so glad that you touched on it now. I think about something even personally for me and my own family. And Stephen, you said this a moment ago, even thinking about what it means to commute. It's so interesting. I never really thought about commuting being a part of the collective housing crisis. It's just so normal, and it's such a critical part of so many people's lives. And I think a lot of us really thought more about it during COVID, when we didn't have to necessarily drive to work. I'm thinking about, people that live outside of Atlanta and had to drive into the city. Or for me, at the time I lived in Baltimore and driving, closer to Washington, D.C., it just felt normal. So it's very interesting that you brought that up. I'm sure there are a number of people that are listening right now that are thinking, there's no way I could possibly live close to my job because it's too expensive, or the housing is too small, or just doesn't meet my needs. So Jonathan, for this next question, I'm going to start with you. And you alluded to this a bit, particularly when we think about collective community and collective orientation. When we think about infrastructure and communities in terms of transportation and community resources to support improving community development and housing availability, what do you believe we could do to further support or advocate for an infrastructure in communities that's housing focused, that's housing first, that's also being considerate of transportation and those wraparound services?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the patterns of people's lives, and I think listening to the patterns of working people. So a lot of the plans in cities that have been made for public transportation, if you talk to the people who actually do service work, often public transportation doesn't serve them very well. There's actually a wonderful story from the civil rights movement that we don't often apply to city planning, but I think it's a valuable lesson. In the Montgomery bus boycott, when the folks decided to stay off the buses, they didn't know how long they were going to stay off. And after they realized that these folks were going to fight them for a while, they had to come up with an alternative system to get people to work. Otherwise, people weren't going to have money. And the churches volunteered their vehicles, and some individuals did also. But the key thing that happened was the people who were using the buses sat down and planned where the cars were going to be and how the dispatch system would work. And what the people who used that dispatch system said is that it got them to work and back faster than the buses ever did. So when the people who were, using the services were involved in planning them, it was much easier for people to get to work. I think cities can learn from that, and some have, in terms of the public, not just the public, but in particular the people who use the buses or who use the trains or who use the light rail, or who might be the people who would use them, to involve those people in the planning of how the routes will run. And it can, so transportation can be a key in terms of building community if it helps people to get from where they are to the places where they need to be. And I think you have to listen to people in order to know how to do that at a systemic level.
I agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree. You have to consult with people. And how about you, Stephen? Do you have any perspective on that, on transportation and building infrastructure?
Well, the capacity to get from one place to another is really the key, right? And the kinds of infrastructure that we need to be connected to housing. So just because you may have a place to live doesn't mean it serves you well. If there's no public transit if you don't own a car, if there's no bus system and you're not close to a bus, you might have the most amazing home in the world, but it's not going to serve you. What we have right now is so many crises bounded up in housing. Economists and urban geographers calls this the housing fit mismatch or the spatial mismatch. It's the type of housing that we have isn't fitted to where people need to be. And so it results in things like supercommuting. Think about the harms of sitting in traffic for 3 hours a day, an hour and a half or 90 minutes each way. Number one, people who sit in traffic that long are more likely to have hypertension, stroke, and heart attack. So it's bad on your health to just sit in the car for 90 minutes or even an hour. If you look around the country, or just Google supercommuting, you'll see that in the last 20 years, we have an explosion of people who are so-called super commuters. So it's unhealthy for you, number one, which is not true of biking or walking, or even walking to a bus stop. Number two, think about what that means in terms of time with family for parents who have to work maybe 2 jobs and get their kids from the babysitter or get their kids from daycare. That's time taken away from reading, cooking, playing, right? So this commuting problem is a real problem, and it's also, number three, an environmental problem, because people have to be in cars and sitting in bumper to bumper traffic around the DC outer belt, the Atlanta outer belt, or the Bay Area, or LA. So these are all big problems. I wanted to go back, though, to Jonathan's earlier point. We do need to also think about investments. What are the kinds of investments we need? So one kind of investment is in greater and superior bus service. I love rail lines. I love systems like BART, commuter rails, but those are fixed systems and they're not as adaptable to people's changing needs. Yeah. The one thing that is really adaptable are bus systems, and yet bus systems are A, underfunded, and B, they are also often a patchwork, right? If you think about all the different municipalities or regional systems, it's hard how many buses do you have to take, or how many buses do you have to change to get from your house to your job? The answer should be one, right? You shouldn't have to change at all. You should just get on one and then you get there. So I totally agree that we need more investments and we need people involved in planning and designing the routes and the systems.
Absolutely. I'm picking up what you're putting down, particularly when Stephen, when you just talked about quality of life. I mean, our quality of life is greatly altered when we are, don't have adequate transportation that meets our needs. And speaking about quality of life, Stephen, in your opinion, what are some of the services you believe families and individuals could utilize in community if they're facing housing instability or possible homelessness?
So there are so many unfortunate myths about homelessness in the United States. For one thing, most people who are unsheltered are neither alcohol dependent or drug dependent or have severe mental illness. That doesn't mean that people who are unsheltered or homeless don't have that, but most do not. The federal government collects data on this. About a third to 40% have one of those three problems, but that's not a majority. Another myth about homelessness is that actually a majority of people who are homeless in the United States are not long-term, what's called chronic homelessness. So chronic homelessness means that you are either homeless repeatedly over a period of time or over a long period of time. Most Americans who are homeless are not actually chronic homeless. When people are housing unstable, the first thing they tend to do is actually couch surf or double up, and it leads to crowding. I think the number one thing we need to do, really, is we need to invest massively in housing. We need to create more affordable housing, but we also need more multifamily housing. In this country, there are more 3-car garages than there are multifamily housing units. That's a crisis. We have to build more multifamily housing units so that people can live closer to jobs, closer to schools, closer to doctors' offices, groceries, and pharmacies. Instead, we have this obsession with building large single-family homes that they're not affordable, or these expensive luxury apartments. What we need is what's called the missing middle, where we have, a building that maybe has 12 units in it. It's 2 stories, not some super huge skyscraper, and that families, it has 2 or 3 bedrooms so that families with small children or adolescents can move in and have a comfortable, nice place to live. That's really what we need in many of our metropolitan areas. One other thing I'll mention, about 3/4 of people who qualify for housing choice vouchers are on a waiting list right now. They can't get a voucher from their local housing authority because the waiting list can be 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and then they close the list after 4 or 5 years. We need to radically expand our investment and infuse investment so people can get into housing. And we need to do it on the demand side and the subsidy side. We just do not have enough money flowing in. The largest federal subsidized housing program is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, LIHTC. It's just not enough. And it's also a tax credit program. So developers have to stack that with other incentives. We need a massive infusion of affordable housing in order to really meet need in this country. But we're not going to get there.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you beginning there, Stephen, by confronting the myths about homeless folks, because I think those myths are used to cover a bigger lie, which keeps us from addressing this. We say it's because people are homeless because they're addicted, or they're homeless because they're lazy. These myths. I'm a preacher, so I need to say these myths get sort of all these religious overtones too. That people are immoral and that they've made mistakes and bad choices and this and that. But those myths exist because they allow people to justify a situation in which nearly half of the country is living on the edge of not being able to make it. And that, I think, is the big lie that even our government measures don't allow us to see. We talk about all of these federal programs in terms of the federal poverty measure, but it's severely outdated because in mid-1960s, somebody at the Social Security Administration said that you're poor if you don't have 3 times what it takes to feed yourself or your family or whatever the unit is for a month. Well, that might have been a decent measure in the mid-60s, but we've talked about the dramatic increase in housing costs. There's also a dramatic increase in transportation costs, dramatic increase in education costs. I mean, there are things that have thrown off that configuration considerably, such that, an individual who makes more than $13,000 a year isn't considered poor in this country. Tell me, where can you live and be housed on $13,000 a year? The Poor People's Campaign issued a study in 2018 when we launched, and we drew on a report from 2016 that said there was not a single county in the country where someone working a minimum wage job could afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. Nowhere in the country. This isn't just like the urban versus rural. There's nowhere you could do that. So that's just a way of saying this affordability crisis that we're talking about is a result of a kind of myth that we have allowed to continue, and often have lies that justify this myth. But this myth that the prosperous American life is available to most people. It's not. It's not, and half of the country therefore is living on the edge, if not poor.
Yeah. Both of you have such valuable points and contributions. Particularly, I really, really appreciate, and I just have to echo what you just said, Jonathan, even to Stephen, about acknowledging those myths that exist, because it reminds me of something that Lisa said in our previous conversation. And again, if you're watching right now and you didn't watch the part 1, I strongly encourage you to. But one of the things that she brought up is that we as a society have a tendency to blame the individual and not be curious or interrogate the system that the individual is a part of. So all these myths about homelessness and individuals being, all of the labels that are unfortunate and despicable, but not being curious about what kind of system are we operating in that creates these outcomes for people to be unhoused. And Jonathan, speaking of that, you mentioned the Poor People's Campaign. I would like to know a little bit more about your experience with the Poor People's Campaign, in addition to your work with the Rutba House. Could you tell us more about it?
Well, the Ruba House is a house of hospitality, and it really led me to the campaign because I have lived for 2 decades with people who, for all of the reasons Stephen mentioned earlier, became unhoused. I live in Durham, North Carolina, the city of medicine. One of the main ways people become unhoused in our city is they get sick and they go in the hospital, and especially if they're there long term, the bills become astronomical. They haven't been able to work. So if you were in any way vulnerable, which I just mentioned earlier, half the country is, you come out of a place like this without anywhere to go. But it's not the only way. I mean, people are vulnerable because of family crises that happen. People are vulnerable because of personal crises. People are vulnerable often because of issues that they have to deal with because of what this country has asked them to do. We've hosted a lot of veterans at our house, and people who have become unhoused after coming back from fighting for this country. So it was that experience that made me realize that what you were pointing to, that Lisa said last time, that this is not about individuals and their choices as much as it is often about the choices we have made collectively in terms of how we're going to care for one another and what is going to be available to people, especially in times of need. And as a Christian, I had to go back to the Bible. And one of the things I realized after knowing so many people's stories is that the prophetic books of the Bible speak directly to these systemic issues. Isaiah the prophet says, woe unto you who make unjust laws and make women and children your prey, which is to say vulnerable people aren't able to make it in your society because of the laws that you're passing, the policies that exist. And so the Poor People's Campaign has become a collective way for myself and many other people who understand that this system impacts all of us, whether you are consider yourself directly impacted by a particular injustice, or whether you're just participating in this community where some people have enough and some people don't. That really does impact us. It really does affect the kind of people we are and the kind of children we can raise and the kind of vision we share for what we want our communities and our country to be. And so I'm grateful to be part of a collective that is led by people who have been directly impacted by poverty and who realize that poverty is a choice that our society has made, that we have the resources to address poverty. We know the policies that could make a difference. We have collectively chosen to elect people who are not taking action, which means collectively we have to make different choices and we have to make that clear to the people who are running for office. And so since 2018, this campaign has been putting an agenda that is led by people directly impacted. It's been putting it in front of the country and really making elected representatives answer to the question of whether they are willing to really address the problem at the scale that it must be addressed. Too much of our approach to the housing crisis or the affordability crisis in its broader, people who are poor understand that even the efforts we've made haven't taken the scale of the problem seriously, and so it often feels like a little toss in the bucket. Often people are actually insulted by what politicians do and will proudly say they're doing for affordable housing, when you know that it's not going to actually in any way come near meeting the need that's available. So challenging folks to really take serious the scale of the problem is the main thrust of the third Reconstruction Resolution, which is in the House, the United States House right now, and really outlines what it would mean at a federal level to take seriously this crisis, and housing is certainly a piece of that. But it begins with what I was saying earlier, was saying that we have to change the way we measure poverty. We have to take seriously the level of poverty that exists in this country, and then we have to evaluate all of the programs that we have and that we are pushing for in terms of whether they would actually meet the scale of the problem that we're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of poverty and obviously socioeconomic status, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the ways in which gentrification is altering communities greatly. You mentioned this a moment ago, Jonathan, about the community that you live in and what has happened over time. What strategies, because I think that's what we're here for, we want to consider what strategies can be implemented to prevent gentrification, but ultimately the displacement of vulnerable populations, vulnerable communities, particularly when it's interesting, the language is that we're in a period of rapid urban growth and urban development, but we're also wondering, but where are these people living? So what are some strategies that we could potentially consider for making sure that vulnerable populations aren't displaced due to gentrification?
You send that to me, Tyranny, or Jonathan?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Either one of you, but Stephen.
So one of the things that was remarkable about the past few years is that the whole country put into place an eviction moratoria in various levels. And it was remarkably effective at the time it was in to slow, not perfect, but it's slowing during a period, by the way, of rapidly escalating housing costs, of slowing a lot of displacement and gentrification. So we know what works. We know that rent controls can work. We know that eviction moratoria, we know that just cause eviction laws, all of these regulations can help. But we also need to make sure that we are building housing for people to remain in place, because people also need to have choice. They need to be able to move if they want to move and not feel stuck either. So what we need to do is for younger generations who are coming up to be able to live in the communities if they want, that they grew up in, and not feel that they have to move to a different city or far away. So some of these policies, we know that they work, and they can be put in place. They're politically difficult in many cases, but they do work.
Thank you for that. That makes perfect sense to me, right? How about you, Jonathan? I see you preparing to say something.
Well, yeah, I mean, amen to what Stephen's saying. At the policy level, I think that's absolutely true. I'll just add what I've seen at the community level is that it's encouraging to see communities coming together to take action about casting a vision for how they want their own communities to be developed. So there's a community in North Carolina called the North Side community that saw gentrification coming and decided to organize. And they developed what they call their Compass Council. So the neighbors elect one person from each block to the Compass Council, and the Compass Council meets once a week. And they started with a big map of the neighborhood on the wall. And these are people who've lived there, so they know folks. They know who owns their house, who rents their houses. So they started mapping it out and saying, Miss Smith's been there 50 years. We should ask Miss Smith, what does she plan to do with her house? Is she going to leave it to her kids, or what's her plan? And they started talking to neighbors about the plan and started saying, we understand that places in our community are going to be redeveloped, but we want to have some say in how it gets developed. And so that council started, taking collective action. They partnered with a land bank. They were able to put some properties in the land bank, work with developers who wanted to do, affordable options. They did at the end of one cul-de-sac, they did a little tiny house community, because they knew that were going to increase density, and that they were single people who wanted to live that way. So they sort of took power and were able to negotiate with the other various players because they were an organized community. I think things like that are incredibly powerful and need to happen alongside these efforts to have the significant investment that's needed, again, to meet the scale of the issue at the state and federal level.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned, Jonathan, like the tiny house community, because we're seeing some of those developments. And my next question was actually going to be to the two of you around how could we, what are some innovative ways in which we could utilize land to develop more sustainable housing for communities? And I'm really proud to say that when I lived in Baltimore, I was a part of a compass group where, we were meeting regularly to think about the future of our neighborhood and speaking to those political stakeholders about how we saw the community evolving. But from either one of you, from your experience or ideas that you may have about how we can utilize land to develop more sustainable housing.
Well, I'll provide one or two examples. I hate to name specific bills because it draws attention to them as opposed to the policy principle. But there's a bill that's being considered in California called SB4 that would let churches, particular religious groups and nonprofit colleges, build homes, particularly affordable housing, on their land, especially excess land.
Mm.
And there are churches in Oakland who have been eager to do this. They have extra land, but the city won't let them do it, or the zoning regulations won't let them do it, or the neighborhood opposes it. So we need to free institutions who have land to be able to develop for affordable housing purposes and not let wealthy, affluent, NIMBY neighbors oppose those developments because they don't want. Look, this is part of the problem. We have to mention this. So many communities don't want affordable housing in their neighborhood, and they don't want homeless shelters or resource centers in their neighborhood. And every community needs to have its fair share of affordable housing. It just has to. Otherwise, some communities shoulder all the burden of that, and that's not fair. So we need to make sure that institutions like churches and so forth are able to use their excess land to provide affordable housing, because there is a moral and, I'll say it, a spiritual imperative, for the reasons Jonathan mentioned, to do that.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Churches in some places have, land holdings that are pretty incredible. And part of that is churches that are grappling with the issue of historic harms are dealing with the fact that some of that ownership, and the way that we talk about ownership in our society, is the result of injustice, right? It's the result of stealing land. It's the result of stealing bodies and using those bodies to make money that they used to buy land. So where churches are having conversations about what justice demands, of the congregation itself, it is encouraging to me to see that some of those, both individual congregations and denominations, are talking about just what you're saying, how not only they can use their land, but also invest their resources in affordable housing. From the pastoral side of things, I'll just say that I think the church needs to recognize that as an important part of its vocation as a community builder, right? The church is called to be a community builder, and so much of what people think that's meant for so long in our communities is, it's a space where people gather once a week or twice a week, or it's a spiritual center. Well, there's some important things that happen there. I think the church has a role to play in that way. But man, you can build a lot of community by, just like Stephen was saying, creating not just housing, but housing that's more community oriented. A lot of shared family housing will have, private space, but there's a lot of stuff we can share. How often do you use the dining room in your house? A lot of, co-housing spaces have a big dining room so that, when people have their family reunion or people in town, they have a place that a large group can gather, but they also have a smaller space in their private area. Sharing recreational space and those kind of things. A lot of that can happen when churches and other groups invest in creating the spaces for community to happen and to make that affordable, and a vision for folks being able to share life from different income bases is very important.
Tyranny, if I could just piggyback on that. So one of the things that a lot of Americans don't understand about housing is they think housing is either you own it or you rent. A friend of mine did a study in Oakland recently that you can find on tenure types. And tenure is just a fancy legal term that means the different kinds of arrangements for owning or participating or residing in land. And his study found that there were over 56 tenure types in Oakland alone. There are co-ops, there are land trusts, there are all sorts of living arrangements that people don't necessarily think of, that aren't the simple, here's an apartment or here's a home. And Jonathan was just talking about that. Something I'd like to emphasize is that the homelessness crisis, and in fact the whole larger affordable housing crisis in the United States, is actually a fairly recent problem. Don't get me wrong, we've had a lot of problems in the United States for many years: structural racism, institutional racism, Jim Crow, and poverty. We've had high levels of poverty for hundreds of years, but we've never actually had a homeless crisis like we have now. And there's two or three reasons for that. One reason for that is because we have completely shifted from multifamily and different housing arrangements. Used to have boarding houses, like Jonathan was sort of alluding to, where you could have dozens of families living in there sharing communal spaces, and SROs. Those are gone, largely gone, just disappeared. And we've shuttled people either into, again, apartments or single family homes. We used to actually have all sorts of communal living arrangements. We've gotten rid of that. And then, of course, deinstitutionalization contributed to this, right? We emptied our hospitals and psychiatric institutions in the 80s and left people just on the street.
Yeah.
So I want to emphasize that we've had poverty. And shout out to Jonathan alluded to Molly Orshansky, who was the census bureaucrat who came up with the measure of poverty, which is why the census now has a supplemental poverty measure. But we've always had poverty. We've never had homelessness like this, with the simple exception of the Hoover towns during the Great Depression. This is unique, nefarious, and new.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you for clarifying that and highlighting that, Stephen. I think that's really important because, I mean, even with you saying it, I had my own aha moment about all of this, thinking about census records, thinking about, what my family looked like, years ago versus how they live now, and for so many families, how they live now. So again, thank you for highlighting that. We could talk about this all evening long. So I really hope that many of you join us for the second part of the conversation afterwards. Also, many of you may be noticing there are some resources that are scrolling on the bottom of the screen. Those resources are provided by our panelists. So please check those out so that you can grow in your vocabulary and understanding of the housing crisis. And speaking a little bit more about that, even making it more personal to the King Center. So in 1966, Dr. King and his family moved into Chicago to get closer to the housing fight. And what are some actions we can draw from that experience? I'm sorry, what are some actions we can take to draw attention to the struggle that people are contending with today? I think, Stephen, what you just did was great for me because I didn't think about that before. But what are some other things that we could do to make sure that people are aware of what's really going on?
Well, one thing I'll mention quickly is that there are unions that are forming across the country, unions of unhoused people. There's a national homeless union. There's also a national tenants union and local unions of tenants that are organizing. I think it's important to join these unions if you're someone in that situation. But it's also important to recognize again that these are issues that impact our communities, and so even if you're not a member of the union, you can support the union. And I think it's a good way to be in relationship with people who are literally fighting for a place to be in your community. And if you just believe, at your moral center, whatever informs your moral center, if you believe everybody deserves a place to be, then it makes sense to join the people who are fighting for a place to be. So join your local tenants union or union of the homeless and they all have demands and often have actions that bring the community together to make those demands known.
One thing I want to add is that so Dr. King fought for so many issues. In the South, he was fighting public accommodation segregation. He was fighting for voting rights. But when he turned north, and particularly when he moved into the suburbs of Chicago, to fight for fair housing, he said, quote, "I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hateful as I have seen in Chicago," he told a reporter. And part of the reason I say that, remind everyone that, is because the fight against racism, particularly institutional and structural racism, can be hardest in the places where you think you've got, the people and the politicians on your side. And you can just look at places like San Francisco and the Bay Area, which are we're incredibly diverse, but highly segregated regions. So it's not, where we think necessarily the Deep South that you see some of the most entrenched opposition to affordable housing. It was in Marin County, and it was in San Francisco where you had some of the strongest fights against these homeless centers that would help pair homeless people with housing opportunity. It was the most intense NIMBYism
Mm.
against that. So we have to take this fight everywhere, particularly the North and the West, and particularly the wealthiest and frankly bluest cities in the country are often where this fight is going to be the hardest, because this is where displacement and gentrification is most acute and intense.
Mhm.
Yep.
Absolutely. I agree. We have to spread the word and move into these various spaces. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are joining us that are thinking when we say the word homelessness or unhoused, there's a particular image that pops up in their head about who that person is, what that family looks like. But I'd like to personify. Let's give some human characteristics to some of the people that are really challenged with being housed appropriately. And I'll just share just a personal story really quickly. I was I did community work in the city of Baltimore, and I worked with some local schools. And there were so many families that were being displaced and they were living in hotels. So thinking about children that were going to school that were going home to hotels in the afternoon or going to, women's shelters. So when we think about individuals that are unhoused, can you give us a description of what that looks like and who's really impacted by this? I want to say all of us are, but can we personify those individuals really quickly?
Well, I'll tell a quick story. We just celebrated Tony's birthday. Tony lived with us the last 7 years of his life, and our kids were, old enough to remember him, so we always celebrate his birthday. Tony came to the United States when he was 12 years old. He and an older cousin crossed the border from Mexico. He was born Antonio, south of the border. Came for work and worked from the time he was 12 until he was in his mid 60s and got lung cancer, probably because of things he had inhaled, in the fields where he had worked. And came to live at our house after he was released from the hospital. They called us and said, if he were documented, he would be eligible for disability, but he's not, so he doesn't know where to go. So Tony came and lived with us the last 7 years of his life. And one of the gifts of eating dinner with him is that he had picked in every field in America. So we never ate a meal where he didn't know where everything on the table came from. And he taught our kids everything, everything we ate. I picked this in Washington State. I picked this in Maine. I picked this in Florida. He knew it all. But was somebody who just in his whole persona dispelled one of the most common myths about homelessness and poverty, which is that, people are poor because they're lazy. This is the hardest working man I ever met. Even, with the half a lung he had left, he never stopped working around the house. He was always gardening and painting and doing something. He was incredibly hardworking and a gifted person and full of life and joy. And so there are people like this in every community, who may be far from the people that they are most connected to, but who nevertheless are part of the human family and who bring all the gifts and joys with that. So I think that's just one glimpse of someone who is considered homeless, but who in many ways enriched our home in the years he lived with us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing Tony's story, Jonathan. Appreciative. We have a few moments left in our conversation, and I want to. Oh, Stephen, I'm sorry. Did you have something you'd like to contribute?
I don't want to mention person by name, but there's a number of people that I know that have struggled with being unsheltered in the Bay Area, and it's not. Again, it's similar to what Jonathan was saying. These are not people who are not working. So I know someone who is a third generation Bay Area resident. She works basically a full time at a local retail store, but simply cannot afford the rent. And so she works she works an afternoon shift, and then she goes to the shelter in San Francisco in the evening, and then starts the whole thing up the next day. And part of this, one of the things that Jonathan mentioned earlier, but I want to make a point about, and I think Tierney, you alluded to this, is that the generational changes. So during the Great Migration, so many millions of Black Americans moved out of the South to the North and the West and places like California. And that generation, particularly the generation that settled in places like West and East Oakland and Bayview Hunters Point in the 1950s and 60s, is now getting very elderly and passing away. And what happens is that the younger generations, particularly the children, not the grandchildren, you've got 5 or 6 siblings who one of them can't buy out the others to keep that family in the home. And so there's a hard choice that has to be made, especially for multi-generational households, which, by the way, this is exactly the person I was just describing who is currently homeless. She was living with her grandmother, and her aunts and uncles basically said, you got to go. We're going to sell this house. So, and I've heard too many stories like that right now, and it's really breaks me up.
Yeah. That is a common story, unfortunately, in many communities, and Black and Brown communities most pronouncedly, about people not being able to afford to stay in the family home, or families not being able to agree to what we need to do to make sure we preserve and protect this land or this house. So as we begin to wrap up our conversation, which has been absolutely amazing, thank you so much for your contribution. What are some things that what are some suggestions that we could give some of our listeners, some of our watchers, on how they can be a part of the solution? What are, some tangible ideas, some solutions that you all have? Maybe on the communal level, individual level, systemic level? Either one. Jonathan?
I'll just say real quickly, one, try in whatever way you can to know neighbors who are fighting for a place to be. I think it's incredibly important just to relationally stay in touch with your neighbors who, and I'm, as I said earlier, this is incredibly difficult because these folks are crying out collectively. So you can find, the local organizations that are doing this and stay in touch. But then I think the other thing is to be in community that's committed to taking collective action. The Poor People's Campaign is committed to this. There are other campaigns that are committed to affordable housing. We need to build a big and a broad coalition of people who say this is the right thing and we want it collectively. And so plugging into that and staying connected is incredibly important.
I love those suggestions. I would go back we've canvassed a number of policy ideas during the course of this wonderful hour. But in terms of what individuals can do, is number one, if your city or municipality is thinking about, or there's a proposal for affordable housing or a relocation center or even a shelter, think about those people more than the property values. Because this is what happens, is that the NIMBYism so much, the not in my backyard sentiment is so much driven by, I'm worried about what this will do to my property values, as opposed to thinking about housing as a human right. So we have to make sure, especially in our blue cities, that there is affordable housing in every neighborhood. And when a development proposal comes up, think very carefully about whether you are opposing it for selfish reasons or some other reason. So that's what we can individually do, is go to those meetings and support these proposals, whether it's an affordable housing development. There are all sorts of developments that are 50, 60% affordable built into it. And still you get mostly neighbors coming out screaming about how terrible it's going to be. If you show up in support of that at your planning meeting, you can't imagine what a difference even one voice can make.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, for your contribution and being with us for both sessions. Thank you, Jonathan. It was a pleasure to meet you and have your contribution this evening. It was a pleasure to hear both of you.
Thank you both.
Yes, absolutely. And I hope that our watchers and are found some empowerment throughout this conversation and can make an impact in their community. So thank you for this beloved community talk. Remember, if you're looking for ways to get involved and with addressing the issues of affordable housing, please stay online for our virtual Courageous Conversation that starts at 7:15. Remember, you can scan the QR code that's on the screen and go ahead and register and join that virtual dialogue. You can also get involved by visiting the King Center's website and donating to support programs like the Beloved Community Talks. And finally, it is not too late to take the Beloved, Be Love, a challenge and pledge. Again, if you miss any part of our conversation, the first part of the conversation is you can watch it on the King Center's YouTube and Facebook. And this recording will be available tomorrow on the King Center's YouTube page as well. Thank you all for joining us. And together, let's create a world where injustice ceases and love prevails. I'll see you at 7:15.
Affordable housing affects us all. It shapes our neighborhoods, impacts our families, and determines our future. In fact, your zip code has a greater impact on your health than your genetic code. So what can you do? By engaging in meaningful conversations, we can drive greater awareness, challenge existing norms, and pave the way for transformative change. We invite you to join the Be Love in the Housing Crisis conversation in partnership with the King Center and Inclusive. This online conversation will use the inclusive conversation model designed to create a safe space for open dialogue and engage with individuals from various backgrounds. You'll have the opportunity to share your own experiences and perspectives on affordable housing, deepen your understanding of the issue, and explore ways you can take action. Mark your calendar and register to attend this conversation on July 25th at 7:15 p.m. Eastern. Affordable housing is not just a matter of shelter. It is a fundamental human right that shapes the fabric of society. Together, we can contribute to a world where safe, sustainable, and affordable housing is within reach for all. Join us.